I'm dedicating this program to you tonight because it's very important that you sit back and listen to this story and to the guests who are about to come on this program tonight, because we need to defend ourselves. We need to make sure that our constitutional rights continue to be there, and they will not be unless programs like this are continued to air, unless programs like this get out into the public so people can start to talk about it, because it is not being heard in many mainstream places. Each year, Congress authorizes the budget of the Department of Defense through a National Defense Authorization Act. As you just heard from Commander Palmer, they approved his atomic museum with this act. The NDAA of 2012, however, is unlike any of the previous ones. This year's legislation contains highly controversial provisions that empower the armed forces to engage in civilian law enforcement and to selectively suspend due process and habeas corpus, as well as other rights guaranteed by the Fifth and Sixth Amendments to the U.S. Constitution for terror suspects apprehended on U.S. soil. The final version of the bill passed the House on December 14th. The Senate the following day. Ironically, it was the 220th birthday of the Bill of Rights. It was signed into law by President Obama on New Year's Eve. With his signature, for the first time since the Internal Security Act of 1950 and the very dark days of the McCarthy era that followed, our government has codified the power of the indefinite detention into law. This law can be used by authorities to detain forever anyone the government considers a threat to national security and stability, potentially even demonstrators and protesters exercising their First Amendment rights. Now, while the law does not explicitly target U.S. persons, it neither excludes nor protects them, and hence the problem. Now, throughout the night, we are going to be bringing you special guests here on Coast to Coast. This first half hour, Jonathon Emord, constitutional lawyer, joins us. In the second half hour, David Seaman joins us, independent journalist, frequent contributor to many major news organizations. Tyrell Ventura, the son of Jesse Ventura, joins us next hour, as well as Gerald Celente. And then in our final hour, Alex Jones joins us, plus we'll take phone calls with him. For the first couple hours, co-anchoring this program with me tonight will be none other than Linda Moulton Howe, of course, our award-winning reporter. Linda, how are you?
Well, thank you. And, George, I could not agree with you more about how unnecessary and dangerous the wording in this 2012 National Defense Authorization Act is, especially after talking with a Harvard professor of law and to the senior legal analyst at the ACLU.
Linda will have a very special report on this as well during her monthly segment next week on Coast to Coast AM. She's got some great stories for you, but included in those stories, she is highlighting this National Defense Authorization Act. So Linda and I will be back in a moment with Jonathon Emord as we begin this special report on the NDAA. Is it unconstitutional? That's next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie, and our very first guest tonight as we talk about the National Defense Authorization Act. Linda Moulton Howe is with me, is Jonathon Emord, principal of Emord and Associates, practicing constitutional and administrative law in Washington, D.C. He is the only attorney in history that has defeated the Food and Drug Administration several times in federal court on First Amendment grounds. And here he is. Jonathon, I don't think you've ever met Linda, have you?
I don't think we have.
Well, there you go. Say hello.
Nice to meet you.
Pleased to meet you.
Jonathon, I want to get your take as we continue this discussion with you this half hour on this act, the NDAA, as we will call it tonight. A lot of people are concerned that it is not going to be constitutional, that our rights will be eroded. You are an expert. You are a lawyer. What do you think?
I believe it is unconstitutional. And, in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, Clause 2, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. This has been interpreted to mean that your right to access a court when you are detained may not be encumbered or blocked by the state unless it is in the theater of war, unless there is active open rebellion, whether civil war in the United States or overseas. This act would allow an American citizen on a charge, unsubstantiated charge before a court, a charge that they substantially supported a terrorist organization or terrorist, to be round up by the United States military and incarcerated indefinitely, that is until the end of a formal declaration of the end of the war on terror, which will never likely happen, and to be denied the right under the Fifth Amendment of due process, under the Sixth Amendment to a speedy trial, to a trial by jury, to be informed of the precise charges against you, to confront the witnesses against you, to subpoena witnesses in your defense, and to the assistance of counsel. In other words, you will be thrown in jail as if you were being taken by an absolute monarch or king and ordered into the dungeon.
Forever?
Forever.
Now,
you know, this is not unprecedented, George, unfortunately.
You know, we don't have people like Joseph McCarthy running around, I don't think. But, I mean, if we do, Jonathan, if we get someone who says there's a communist at every corner, or these people are bad, or so-and-so's a terrorist, what kind of dangers, then, do we have with this thing as law?
Well, this thing, you know, it's been our history since English precedent from Lord Coke when the writ of habeas corpus was first created. It's been the history of civilization that when a power is vested in government that is absolute like this, to take a person and incarcerate them and to throw the key away, that it is always abused in the sense that a person is charged and is not given a fair hearing and is condemned. We've seen this in recent history with capital punishment. People have wrongly been accused of murder, have been incarcerated, and they've thrown the key away. Well, at least there was a judicial check so that it didn't happen all the time, as horrible as that is. Without that judicial check, when things happen in secret, when a person can be taken at night and thrown into a military prison and left there with no further notice to anyone, that is the end of liberty.
Linda, what was it about the NDAA that caught your eye?
Well, one of the surprises to me in interviewing the senior legal analyst counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington and talking with Professor Mark Tushnet at Harvard Law School, I wanted to know, one, who has control on this, we'll say, the terrorist alert, and is it clear in this new NDAA whether an American citizen is immediately going to continue to have rights within the American legal system, or will a military authority take over? And here is the surprise. And this is a quote from Christopher Anders, the senior legislative counsel at the ACLU in Washington. Presumably, it is the Defense Department who will control the execution of this wording in the National Defense Authorization Act. But, quote, one of the things that is amazing about this is that the NDAA does not actually say who is making the decision.
Jeez.
It says that the president has this authority, but it does not say if it is the president alone that makes this decision. Is it people in the military itself? Is it civilians in the military? Is it a government bureaucrat somewhere, close quote, all of which leaves an extremely dangerous, murky, ambiguous sort of mist in this NDAA. And then when it comes to you, I, any one of us on the street, if somebody from DOD who is assigned to come and say, we suspect that you are a terrorist, they can take you away. And the unanswered question right now is, would an American citizen automatically remain in the American legal system, or would it transfer into a different track of military authority that happened to Jose Padilla back in 2002? An American citizen arrested, taken into military authority for 5 years without charge.
Jonathon, this act, which comes up every year, who leaked this part of the provision in it? How did that get passed through everybody, Republicans and Democrats?
Well, the sponsors of the bill, Carl Levin and John McCain, put this language into the bill, and Rand Paul authored an amendment to the bill that would have stricken it, but it didn't pass. And the bill passed, with overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate. And so the president, who objected to this provision, interestingly enough, signed the bill nonetheless because he wished to have the other aspects of the bill in place, and said that he would police it so as to not allow these civil liberties violations to take place. But the point is, the law itself is unconstitutional. The ambiguity as to whether or not this is going to be undertaken against American citizens domestically, or whether it's only in the theater of war, is one that is unacceptable. When you have a law that will allow the incarceration, will allow criminal sanction to be invoked, and suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, you must have precise language, or it is unconstitutional. And, the precedent here is for the President of the United States to take action directly or to delegate that authority to military people. That's what Abraham Lincoln did when he suspended the writ of habeas corpus unconstitutionally. Only Congress, under Article 1, Section 9, can do that. Congress has done this here without invoking Article 1, Section 9, but nonetheless, the effect of this is to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And the precedent for the executive department, which will have control over this, is for the president to use it or to delegate it to military leaders to do it. And this is a law now in place that will have an effect not just in this administration, but in subsequent administrations.
And is it good for just 1 year, or is it going to roll over?
Well, the provision is going to be in place here until Congress removes it. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that this thing is going to be around for a while unless we rise up and do something. There won't be a justiciable case or controversy under this until someone's arrested.
That is exactly what the ACLU said, that this is now in one of those strange zones where it is as if this authorization has gone forward and is now a statute of law with code, and that none of us will know exactly how this is going to break out until somebody is arrested under it, and then there's going to have to be a challenge in the courts. And as the ACLU counsel pointed out, if it took 5 years for there to be any kind of court action on Padilla between 2002 and 2007, what would happen to an American citizen if they are arrested under this NDAA and that they are, we'll call it deflected into the military side under authority, and someone tries to hold them without charge and there is no legal proceeding? It means that the ACLU and any other bodies would have to challenge this and try to take it to the Supreme Court if Congress doesn't rescind it. Sir, is that your understanding, that we're now in a kind of strange holding pattern, waiting for an arrest to see what the courts can do to straighten this out?
Well, that's right. And, the provisions of this law talk about it as indefinite. I mean, the detention under Section 1021C1, detention under the law of war without trial until the end of the hostilities authorized by the Authorization for Use of Military Force Act. So,
well, there will never be any end of hostilities under Homeland Security and the threat of terrorism, quote unquote, Jonathon. It'll go on forever.
There would have to be a declaration that there was such an end, and that's unlikely.
And Congress, as the ACLU is saying, the quote, Congress has made a mess of this, and Congress needs to clean it up. And I'm very interested, sir, if you have a perception on why it is that the Senate Armed Services Committee held secret markups on this bill behind closed doors. No one was even allowed in the room. And then it was redrafted in a conference committee. It was again behind closed doors. And that what came out of all of that, these were all secret sessions, left people, even in the ACLU and at Harvard Law School, scratching their heads about what is being produced here and why. Because the consensus seems to be that between the Patriot Act and other laws, that this was not necessary and now is a truly dangerous threat to American civil liberties.
Jonathon, in theory, with this now law, if they didn't like what's going on with these Occupy Wall Street protesters, if they didn't like somebody protesting our stand in Afghanistan, who would push the button to get these people picked up and arrested?
Well, the language of the statute is so ambiguous. If you substantially support a terrorist organization, you may be arrested. What is substantially support? What does that mean? Well, that's going to be the determination of a political leader. It's going to be the president's determination in the last analysis. That person is going to say, all right, well, I think that person substantially supports terrorism. Well, let's say you have a person who is unfortunately predisposed to making rash statements and anti-American statements, which is their right, and they make a statement in support of al-Qaeda or some other organization, but have taken no step to arm themselves to attack the United States in any way or to facilitate that.
Right. Just simply uses rhetoric.
Yes. Well, that person could be arrested under an interpretation which will be made by the executive department if a president wished to incarcerate them or was told by advisors, this person's dangerous, this person is making these statements which are encouraging terrorism domestically and internationally. We think they're affiliated with these people because of the statements they've made. They can be arrested and thrown into a military camp and kept there. And there'd be no opportunity for a judge and a jury to assess whether this was some rash college kid or person who is unstable or who shouldn't be incarcerated because they aren't a threat, or whether it is actually someone who is in aid of terrorism. So what you have here is the root of all evil, which is the right to engage in arbitrary discretion in the hands of those who have military power, who can determine in an instant whether one person or another person goes to jail and can enforce that in the dark of night, like this law was created without public scrutiny. A public trial is guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment. It's public precisely because even with a public trial, the American people are entitled to a check on abuses that take place in the judicial system. And when you have a military tribunal, it is necessarily one that is cloaked in secrecy, and people can be destroyed. This is the history of the Civil War with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus and ex parte McCardle when, Abraham Lincoln famously said, Justice Taney has his ruling, now let him enforce it. When he refused to enforce a writ of habeas corpus from Justice Taney, compelling him to release John Merryman out of Copperhead, a sympathizer with the Confederacy, out of Maryland. And this suspension of this writ of habeas corpus, which there was unconstitutional and is here unconstitutional, is the greatest threat to individual liberty. We have this thing called the Great Writ of Habeas Corpus.
Well, Jonathon, I'm so glad we've got you watching some of these things. Thank you so much for your work. Up next, David Seaman joins us, independent journalist, along with Linda Moulton Howe, as we continue talking about the NDAA. Special report tonight on the National Defense Authorization Act, whittling away at your constitutional rights. Linda Moulton Howe with me, and up next, David Seaman joins us. I'll tell you about him when we come right back. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Linda Moulton Howe with us, and David Seaman joins us this half hour. David is an independent journalist, frequent contributor to Business Insider. He's been a guest on CNN's Headline News, Fox News, ABC News Digital, among others. He's got his own YouTube channel, David Seaman Online, as well. And welcome to Coast. David, thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
Tell me your interest in the NDAA. How did you learn about this?
Sure. So basically what happened is I get tips from my readers on all kinds of topics, and I just sort of pursue them all. And a lot of them don't pan out, but every once in a while you get something good. And I was sent a link to Wired Magazine's blog. They did a posting about the National Defense Authorization Act, which at that point was still in progress. It hadn't yet been approved by the Senate and the House, and it hadn't yet been sent to Obama's desk. But it was still a major concern, and they wrote about it. And their piece was really accurate and factual and well-sourced, but it just wasn't getting much pickup. So I sort of, just drew people's attention to that and built off of it. And that's how I got interested in it.
Same with me, too, David. I got emails from a number of our listeners telling me about this, something I didn't even know about. And I started studying it. And Linda, you too, how did this come to you?
Well, I thought it was especially sneaky that on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2011, while President Obama was still in Hawaii on vacation, that he chose that afternoon when most Americans, their attention would be deflected by New Year's Eve holiday. That's when he signed this NDAA. And remember, he had said that he had originally said, I will not sign this, because he didn't like the wording that left open the possibility that American could end up going through the military side. Well, as I understand it from talking with attorneys, no wording really was restored that would keep the American citizen in the American legal system. It is still in this twilight zone that any of us could be arrested and diverted into military authority like Padilla was, and this is the big dangerous cloud hanging over it, and clearly Obama didn't want people to be paying attention when he signed the 2012 NDAA.
David, you have tried to get some of the mainstream broadcasters to wake up, to look at this. Tell me some of the things you've done, and has it fallen on deaf ears?
I don't know if it's fallen on deaf ears or if it's fallen on ears that are intentionally not listening. Because I have sent, when I first found out about that and I wrote my first article and did my first thing on it, I have a pretty good feel just from a background in PR that I sort of know what's going to take off, right?
Sure.
And I sent off this email to everybody I knew, every reporter, anchor, producer I've ever worked with, and people that I haven't worked with, just people in my contact list, literally everyone, because it was just so clearly a home run. I figured I'd wake up the next morning and it would be the biggest story around the country, and it would be on Fox News, and it would be on ABC and MSNBC. And, before this bill went any further, it would just be killed.
Yeah.
It would be shot dead. And that's not what happened. I sent out this email and got no replies from anybody at the national level. And I'm thinking that's really weird. And then I get a reply from one reporter a couple days later, and his whole answer to me is just, that's very interesting. Not even willing to say, I'm going to pursue this, just that's very interesting. And it kind of sent a chill down my spine. And at that point, I sent out a second round of emails, and it was a similar reaction, and I started questioning myself, is this not something that's important to people? But then I would search online for NDAA, and other bloggers were talking about it. The Huffington Post was writing about it, and Forbes magazine, which is not by any means a magazine that exaggerates about things like this.
That's right.
And they were giving it serious attention. So, I just couldn't put the pieces together, and I still don't understand what's really going on there, because this is clearly a huge story.
They probably, David, I would guess, don't understand the significance of this. It blows right over their head. Like you also said, though, it could be done on purpose. Do they think that this falls into the the bucket of conspiracy theorists, and they just don't want to go there?
Well, here's the thing with that. A conspiracy theory is no longer a conspiracy theory if, A, it's true, and B, it's already happened. I think they sort of had some defense, the mainstream media did, when Obama's administration was saying, don't worry, we've got this, we're going to veto this. So there wasn't all that much outrage because we sort of thought that he was going to be the last line of defense, and when he did veto it, that he would make a very strong public announcement telling the American people what Congress was trying to do. Then they would remove that provision and move forward, and that would be the end of it. But that's not what happened. At the last minute, as your other guest mentioned, they withdrew their veto threat, and he signed it into law literally on New Year's Eve while people were out getting drunk. And when the media is functioning at a very, very low level, it's basically just watching the ball drop at Times Square, and that's it.
I had heard some stories that Carl Levin, whom I know when he was a Detroit city councilman 100 years ago, that he really wasn't going to be a sponsor of the provision, that he was pushed by the administration to do this. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I've heard reports about that, and I've seen the video where that's claimed. I mean, the deeper down this rabbit hole you dig, you really see that this doesn't make sense because the support for this was very bipartisan. I mean, the indefinite detention provisions were drafted by Levin, as you mentioned, and McCain, who's a Republican. He's not a Democrat. And they both drafted this. And then, the Senate shot down the Udall Amendment, which would have done away with this provision and allowed them to pass the rest of it, all of the legitimate sections. It still doesn't add up to me. And I've been doing as much as I can to get to the bottom of it.
And, George, one of the voices of reason was Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. And both before the December 31st sort of under-the-radar signing by Obama, he had said both, I think, on CNN, and then later he was quoted in a Forbes article. And this was Bernie Sanders making all kinds of appeal that what they needed to do was to kick this out and not put any of this in until there was further understanding. And this is a quote from Bernie Sanders, Vermont. The legislation could give future presidents the authority to throw American citizens into prison for life without charges or a trial. This bill also contains misguided provisions that, in the name of fighting terrorism, essentially authorize the indefinite imprisonment of American citizens without charges. And I'm stressing this only to say that there were reasonable voices that were articulating exactly the heart of this wording that now attorneys in the ACLU are saying are a direct threat to American civil liberties. And it was as if those voices of reason were being ignored, exactly as the point is being made by David, that there was a seemingly unreasonable vacuum around this NDAA that, with strong bipartisan support, fighting it and then for it, that it gets passed under the radar by President Obama on New Year's Eve. And I completely agree with David Seaman that this is not, it's as if something else is going on in the background that none of us have yet seen.
David, who supports the resistance to this law now? Young people, old people? How does it skew?
It's really been across the board. The resistance, from what I can tell, is those who know about it. That's what's so astonishing here. I've spoken with Tea Partiers, Occupy Wall Street people, young people, old people. It spans the whole spectrum. The problem is most people I talk to have heard nothing about it. But those who actually find out, within a very short amount of time, they go from that stage of denial of thinking they just stumble across a blog post or a video that's inaccurate to acceptance when they see that the New York Times has covered this, and they did one of their most condemning editorials I've ever seen them do against the Obama administration for this. And once people realize that it's real, then they swing into action and they start telling everybody they know. But the problem is most people just don't know, and the media is, as she mentioned, the media is not doing their job here, and something clearly does not add up.
Right.
I miss the days of Howard Beale from the movie Network, because if we had one of those out there,
we are.
You know, it's us. I guess it's us.
From the windows. We are saying we won't take this anymore.
Well, there's another one right behind the NDAA. It's called the Enemy Expatriation Act, sponsored by Joe Lieberman out of Connecticut, Charles Dent, the Republican out of Pennsylvania. This would give the government the power to strip citizenship away from Americans without being convicted if they think they could be hostile to the United States. And what is the definition, Linda, of being hostile? Who knows?
Well, terrorism is the new communist from the McCarthy era, and we are working now onto very thin ice that the same kind of blackballing and the complete where people lost their jobs and lives were stripped when somebody was called a communist. Now we're moving into the era of they're a terrorist and off they go to jail, never to be heard from again. And this cannot happen in the United States of America if we're going to hold this country to what it is supposed to be.
David, how has this affected you career-wise, you know, standing strong, fighting the good fight? Has it backfired on you?
I've lost some readers, but I think I've gained far more than I've lost. The only thing that's bothered me is that, you know, in the past I've written about things that were controversial, and you get some blowback. Sometimes, you know, a couple of readers will email you and tell you, you know, that you forgot to ask this important person this very important question that you should have asked, and you're being a bit of a sellout by not asking it. And that's just, you know, when you're a writer, that's what you get. You get
that happens.
Response. But something very strange has been happening where a couple of people, and I don't even know their identities, just seem to be after me. You know, I'll post anything, and within seconds, there are responses, and they're extremely vicious. And I don't understand why, because the NDAA is not something that's really up for discussion. The ACLU, Amnesty International, all these human rights organizations, they all interpret it the same way. I'm not even the one analyzing it. I'm just trying to be a clearinghouse for information. And I've never seen this level of personal hatred toward a writer before in my life. And I've noticed it happening to a couple of other journalists who've been covering this heavily on Twitter and elsewhere, where these people just come out from nowhere and you don't know what their agenda is. Well, I guess you do know their agenda is to discredit whoever is really talking this up.
There are some haters out there in the internet land. They're on websites. I mean, they have no life. All they do is sit back and hate because they have no life. You know, they're trapped in their little room and they hate the world. But in your particular case, maybe you're being watched, you know, by some agency.
Well, I mean, I think another possibility is that some people are just really frightened by the implications of this, of what's been done. And so they still want to kind of defend the Obama administration and defend Congress and say, you know, oh, this guy's blowing it out of proportion. This should never be used this way. Because the reality of it, once it sinks in, is that what Obama did in, you know, best case scenario, what Obama did is outright incompetence, and it's unacceptable.
Well, they all did.
Worst case scenario.
They all did it.
Worst case scenario is it something quite sinister, you know.
But they all did it. The House did it. The Senate did it.
Oh, of course.
He signed it. I mean, they were all part of it.
But David, there is a sense of betrayal from President Obama because he knew what this NDAA would do. He articulated it before he put that signature on that afternoon of New Year's Eve. And in talking to the attorney at the ACLU and to Professor Tushnet at Harvard Law, they both said the same thing. We've been 10 years away now from 9/11. Osama bin Laden is dead. We're out of Iraq. We're trying to get out of Afghanistan. The government has no reason at this point. Congress has no reason to try to pass this kind of an indefinite detention statute. And it raises these questions. What else is going on behind the matrix that would have sort of provoked this when it's not necessary, and every legal analyst that I know says this is highly dangerous.
Linda, that's the story.
I completely agree. I completely agree.
That's the story. What is going on that they know about that could happen in a year or two, and they think that they need some kind of a law like this in order to round up Americans? What are they going to do? What do they hear? And to me, that's the bigger story. David?
Well, Colin Powell's former chief of staff went on Russia Today on their cable network, and they've been one of the few cable networks that's been really all over this story. And I guess because they're in Russia, not the U.S., or at least their ownership is. And he said that he thinks the NDAA's indefinite detention provisions will be used against Occupy protesters. In other words, peaceful protesters who are unhappy with the level of inequality in this country and are not afraid to go out there and use, every legal means they have available to them to raise awareness for that.
I would say if we saw what has happened in the Arab Spring, that kind of protest, that kind of people being so upset, that the NDAA would be used without a doubt.
Right. And the issue there is they're going the wrong way because Americans should not fear Americans. This, if there are huge protests and there are millions of people complaining about the government's direction on Twitter and all over the place and on shows like yours, then maybe the government should listen instead of passing new legislation to crack down on these protesters.
I used to get upset with people who burn the American flag. In my early days doing my early radio shows, I even pushed for laws that these people would be arrested and put away, because if they want to burn the flag, then get out of the country, and we're going to arrest you if you don't go. I changed that. I realized that though I don't agree with it, and after spending 9 years in the Navy and loving this country, if you burn the flag, you're a lowlife as far as I'm concerned, because the country and the government are two different things, but it's their right in this country to do that.
The First Amendment says the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And if we are going to start having testosterone pumping laws like this NDAA that can snuff all of that out, we are snuffing out the Constitution and what is left. And this is so important to get across right at this moment, that the ACLU is very concerned about what has happened, and they now have at aclu.org. I hope everyone listening will go to aclu.org, and what you want to do is to find Know Your Rights, what to do if you're stopped by police, immigration agents, or the FBI, and now whoever would be authorized under this NDAA. And it gives right there. You can cut it out and put it in your purse and your billfold and keep forever, and call up and find out where your local ACLU office is and write that phone number on what your rights are and keep it, because the ACLU wants to be at least filling in the gap while maybe the courts are going to wrestle out this NDAA.
David, we have a minute to go. You have the final word.
Yeah, the ACLU is a great resource. Also, just use your voice. We're seeing what's happening now is not only has the NDAA been signed into law, and they're trying to move along with the EEA, the Enemy Expatriation Act, they're trying to crack down on free speech online. So while we have it, let's just tell absolutely everybody we know about this and that it's been signed into law, because, like I said, what I've noticed across the board is once somebody finds out about this and they're convinced that it's real, which doesn't take very long for them to see that it's real, they start telling everyone. It spreads like wildfire.
Oh, there's no doubt. Yesterday, a webmaster, Lex Lonehood, put it on our Twitter feed. Everybody was on this story. Everybody. David's websites are linked up at coasttocoastam.com for you, his Twitter and his website. And, of course, Linda's website, earthfiles.com. In a moment, Linda and I return. We will be talking with Tyrell Ventura, Jesse's son. Get ready for that. Thank you, David. We will be back in a moment.